And as you were just told, my plan today is to give you an overview of a variety of afterlife beliefs that appear across Asia. And my approach is one that looks geographically across different cultures and also chronologically through time. So I use this map because it divides Asia up into regions. Oops. I have a separate laser here for the pointer. The main areas that we're going to be talking about today are going to be the Middle East, South Asia, and then East Asia. Speaking chronologically, I'm going to start around 1800 BCE. And the reason for starting at that point in time is that this is pretty much when we start to get written evidence of afterlife beliefs from various cultures, in particular in those three areas that I mentioned here. So to begin with, I want to talk about the kinds of afterlife beliefs that appear around 1800 BCE in these regions. And to do that, I'm going to go across the, the region here, which at that time is referred to as Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. And that is, in addition to being the seat of ancient Mesopotamian culture, it's also the birthplace of Judaism, which will be part of the lecture later on. But I wanted to show you here that the Bible refers to a figure named Abraham, Father Abraham, the patriarch of Judaism, and tells us that he was born in a town called Ur, and Ur is in Mesopotamia. And the Bible tells us that Abraham and his family moved north and eventually west to the land of Canaan, which is sometimes referred to as the Promised Land. It's the land that God promises Abraham. But we'll more on that later. I just wanted to set the stage for when we get to talk about Judaism, that it's born here in the culture that I'm going to tell you about presently. So, looking at Mesopotamian culture, the thing to talk about is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This text is, it may be one of, if not the oldest written text we have globally that we can read. It's written here on clay tablets, and piecing together the tablets, we've been able to construct a kind of story, an epic tale of the figure Gilgamesh. Is here. And he's a great king from Mesopotamia, from a town called Uruk, which is just north of Ur. So when I previously showed you where Abraham was from, he's from not far from the same place. And the Epic of Gilgamesh tells us about how Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu go on a whole bunch of adventures together, fighting monsters, defeating villains. In this case, technically it says they're fighting a bull, but this is a special kind of bull with wings and a human head. So they fight all kinds of legendary monsters and beasts. In their travels, eventually the story tells us Enkidu gets killed. Gilgamesh is very upset. So Gilgamesh wants to know what happened to his friend upon his death. He goes on another adventure to learn a secret to contact his friend. He performs some rituals, and through those rituals summons up the spirit of Enkidu. The spirit of Enkidu rises up out of the ground like mist, and Gilgamesh asks him, "So what's it like to be dead?" And Enkidu basically answers that it really sucks. So he explains that in the afterlife, if you don't have any children, you don't have anyone to send you food, sacrifices. And without children, then you're just eating scraps, like with dogs at the gutters at the side of the table. If you do have children, though, especially if you have lots of children, that's even better. Then you have people left behind who will make sacrifices, offerings to their ancestors, and through those sacrifices, they send the food, the drink, on to the underworld, and then allow for the ancestors to enjoy a banquet, and at least get as much pleasure as possible from the afterlife. It sucks for Enkidu and would suck for Gilgamesh because they don't have kids. So Gilgamesh is not happy with this perspective on the afterlife. He then decides to go on another adventure to find out how to become immortal. So then he would never die. Luckily for him, there is somebody who had become immortal. The story tells us of a figure named Utnapishtim. It's a big long name, but this figure, Utnapishtim, he and his wife, they were given a gift of immortality, and they live on a special island somewhere far away, hidden from the world. Gilgamesh goes on a long journey to find them, and he winds up finally making it there after this excruciating voyage. He arrives at the place where Utnapishtim and his wife live. Once there, we hear a little bit in the epic about the story of Utnapishtim, and I want to tell you a little bit about Utnapishtim, just again to make a tie back to Judaism. The story tells us about how Utnapishtim became immortal. It tells us that the gods of the Mesopotamians created people specifically because they wanted somebody to worship them. So they made people for that purpose. If people were going to do what they were supposed to do, they would need to worship the gods, and to worship the gods, they would make sacrifices to them in the same way that the story tells us Enkidu expects that that descendants will make sacrifices to ancestors. So Utnapishtim was one of these people making their sacrifices and worshiping the ancestors, but the gods, it says, at some point became disappointed with their project. People were not worshiping them well enough. People were not paying enough attention to them. And the gods collectively decided this whole thing was a mistake. We shouldn't have bothered making people. We should just kill them all. So they all agree, we're going to kill them all. And the way they decide to do it is they're just going to flood the whole planet. Flood them out. One of the gods, though, he speaks up and says, not all of them are not doing their job. Like, there's a guy like Utnapishtim who actually is making the sacrifices. But the gods just decide, this is it, we're going to just flood them all. It was a mistake, we shouldn't have done it in the first place. So then this one god goes to Utnapishtim and tells him, this is going to be a bad situation, there's going to be a huge flood, you should build a boat. So when the flood comes, you won't die in the flood. So he and his wife, they build this boat, the flood comes, they survive the flood because they have the boat, everybody else dies. Some people, if you're not familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, this might sound familiar from another story. So, the reason to tell the story here of Utnapishtim is to draw the connection back to the story of Noah and the flood. And the Epic of Gilgamesh even contains details like, if you're familiar with the story of Noah and the flood, at a certain point during the flood, Utnapishtim releases a bird to see if the floodwaters have receded. That's the same thing that happens in the biblical story of Noah. And there's been a lot of discussion about why are these two stories similar. So I wanted to, if I go back, point again to the fact that Abraham is from Mesopotamia and he moves here. It should be no coincidence then that he brings stories with him from ancient Mesopotamian culture, so that the story of Noah isn't a copy of the story of Utnapishtim. It is just the same story having been carried across many, many miles. Okay, then I'll save more talk about Judaism till later. But this is the story of Utnapishtim, and once the floodwaters stop, Utnapishtim makes sacrifice to the gods again because that's the kind of guy he is. And then the gods realize, maybe we made a mistake because there are good people who were doing good sacrifices. So as a reward, they decide to make him immortal. Great. Gilgamesh, now here's the whole story of how did Utnapishtim become immortal. Gilgamesh wants to know how he can become immortal. So Utnapishtim tells him, well, you can't really become immortal. So they debate whether this is possible or not. And Utnapishtim finally says, all you would need to do to become immortal is you just need to stay awake for 6 days. Gilgamesh says, no problem. I'm big and strong and used to all kinds of hardships. I can do that. But this is at the end of a massive voyage to get to Utnapishtim. So as soon as he starts trying to stay awake for 6 days, he falls asleep right away. Then he learns the lesson, he doesn't really learn the lesson, but we're supposed to, I think, learn the lesson that death is unavoidable. He ends up still fighting against it by a whole bunch of other things we don't need to get into, but we learn then death is inevitable. And if we go back to the thing that he was trying to avoid, the fate of his friend Enkidu, that the ancestral cult, the worship of ancestors, the veneration of ancestors, making sacrifices to your ancestors in order to ensure that they have a comfortable afterlife, is core to the Mesopotamian view on the afterlife. Okay, I wanted to, maybe before I show you those, tell you something about those first. Moving from Mesopotamia over to India. In India, the stories we have relating back to 1800 BCE, they come from the Vedas. Those are the scriptures of Hinduism. And the Vedas tell us about people who lived around the time of 1800 or so. They describe a nomadic people, and in terms of the afterlife, who practice, again, ancestor rituals, ancestral worship that looks very much like the ancestral worship described in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Vedic version of the ancestor cult, the patriarch of the family is expected to lead the sacrifices, make regular offerings up to the ancestors, remembering deceased family members, not just the ones whose names you might remember because they were 1 or 2 generations away, but the ones whose names are forgotten, get lumped together into a big collective, an ancestral grouping. Those people are believed to live in a place called the Patarloka. Patarloka meaning basically the location of the fathers, location of the ancestors. They all go to the same place. And in the Patarloka, it's not necessarily a bad place, so long as, again, there are descendants who know their duty to make the sacrifices and make the sacrifices properly, and know that they, in addition, have a duty to have more children of their own so that when they're dead, there will still be someone there to make the sacrifices, and on and on and on into the future. In the event that some family doesn't do the sacrifices, the Vedas describe a particular situation. The person who receives sacrifices and is happily living in the Patarloka is considered an ancestor, an ancestral spirit. The person who does not receive the sacrifices, the term for them is a hungry ghost, which makes sense because now they're not getting sacrificial banquets to enjoy, so they're hungry, and when they're hungry, they're angry, and when they're angry, they come after you to try to make you give them food. Okay, so then the description involves a little bit more detail in terms of the possibilities, but still the general framework of it is the same. You need to have descendants, and the descendants have to understand the importance of making sacrifices, and then the descendants have to make those sacrifices in order for the ancestors to be happy. When the ancestors are happy, the ancestral spirits can come and actually help. One thing worth considering is that today we talk about luck. That's not a concept, really, that's that old. Ancient peoples didn't think of things happening just by luck, that good for you, you were lucky, or too bad for you, you were unlucky. It is good for you, the spirits helped you, and the spirits helped you because you did the sacrifices you were supposed to do to make the ancestors happy. So there's no luck involved. You have control over your own luck, right? Instead of things being unlucky, it's because you didn't do the sacrifices enough properly to the right spirits, and so now there are hungry ghosts out there coming after you, making bad things happen, and you can change your luck by making the correct sacrifices to the correct spirits. I wanted to show you some passages from some Vedas, just to give you examples of the kind of language that's there. They were the gods' companions at the banquet. Those are the ancestors, not just any of the dead, those are the wise ancestors. That means the people who really understood that they were supposed to do the sacrifices. Here is a prayer to the god Agni. And Agni is a god of fire. So if you are going to be making sacrifices by burning things, you need to have Agni's help because he's the god of fire. He's the one who's going to consume the sacrifice and transmit it to the intended recipient. And they pray, with heat consume him, bear this man to the region of the pious. O Agni, to the fathers, send him who goes with our oblations, wearing new life. Let him increase his offspring. Let him rejoin a body. So then in that passage, you see the language talking about hoping that the god of fire will transmit the sacrifice to the fathers, transmit the actual deceased to the land of the fathers, and that in new life, he can increase his offspring, that even in death, the ancestor has the capacity to help grow the living tribe. Right? This is, imagine a tribe that grew to be big and strong and successful, has lots of children. Today we might consider that there might be some luck involved in conception, and if somebody's not lucky enough to have children, they weren't lucky to conceive. Here they would refer to it as being an issue with the sacrifices. Did they do enough sacrifices to make it so that the ancestors could come and allow the living members of the tribe to conceive and grow the tribe to get bigger and bigger? Let him rejoin a body. For now, I just wanted to say that the idea here is that the living member of the tribe obviously has a body like we do. Then that person dies. Then sacrifices can be made, prayers to the god, like Agni, sacrifices to the god, sacrifices to the ancestor to help transmit that person to the world of the ancestors, in which they rejoin a body. Not a physical body like the one we have, because we don't see ancestors all the time, but some form of body, a spirit body of some kind. We'll talk more about the implications of this in a little while. And then this last passage, these two, I note, they're from the Rig Veda. That's the earliest Veda, in case anybody cares about those scriptural details. This one's from the Atharva Veda. It's a little bit later. But the description here of the afterlife, he hath reached heaven who hath made sacrifice. There in the world of heaven, whole lakes with lotus blossoms shall approach thee, full lakes of butter with their banks of honey, flowing with wine and milk and curds and water. So it's a land of abundance. All of the things that might help one live are there in the land of the dead. Okay. Oh, I wanted to mention then, since I had China up on the thing, I'll mention just that. Similarly, we find ancestral worship appearing in ancient China around the same time of 1800 BCE, and the details are very similar to how things operate in the Indian context. One difference is that some of the Chinese documents indicate that it seems they also engaged in human sacrifice, which is a little bit different than what the others are doing, where they're only engaging in animal sacrifice. And you find the ancestral cult or ancestral worship appearing throughout Central Asia and Northern Asia. The individuals who would communicate with the ancestors. So if you're worried about how do you overcome what we might today call bad luck. Bad things are happening. Back then they know it's because there's some angry ghost out there. We need to find out what the ghost is angry about. What do they need to not be angry? So then we might need somebody who has a particular skill to go and talk to those spirits. Shamans are like the quintessential agent to speak to spirits. And the word shaman comes from Siberia. It's from one of the indigenous cultures in Siberia, specifically that word. But then you can apply that word more broadly to what I call shaman types. So that there would be different types, these different, whatever they're called, in different cultures. In India, they're called Rishis. The Rishi in India is essentially the shaman type. That's the person who is responsible for communicating with the spirits. So, ancestor worship, performed by offering sacrifices of food, drink, and sometimes blood, usually blood of an animal, sometimes of a human in certain cultures, and offered up through fire, burning, or libation, pouring on the ground, to placate gods, spirits, and ancestors. If these are performed properly, these rituals guarantee success and health for the living. Failure to perform leads to illness and disaster caused by angry spirits. At the time around 1800 BCE, this is the prevailing belief relating to afterlife across Asian culture. Okay, now we're going to move through time. From around 1000 to 600 BCE, a number of changes happen. I'm going to go again geographically through those various changes. Now we can go to the Middle East and talk about Judaism. So in talking about Judaism now, I go back to Abraham and his story, and I want to tell one particular story from Abraham, although Abraham has a number of adventures that span across a number of books and a number of chapters, I should say, in the Bible. But these all appear in Genesis between 12:31 and Genesis 22. All right. In the story, Abraham has a wife named Sarah, and they don't have a child of their own, and it concerns them greatly that they don't have a child. It concerns them so much that they don't have a child that Sarah conspires to come up with a plan to ensure that their family can have a child. And that plan is that Abraham should conceive a child with their servant, a woman named Hagar. So, why should having a child be so important to them? I'm contending, based on what I told you about Mesopotamia and the Abrahamic root, the fact that Abraham has roots in Mesopotamia. If he's importing stories like the story of Utnapishtim, he is likely also importing beliefs like ancestor worship. Then you understand why it would be so important for people to have children, because if they don't have children, the ancestral cult is going to cease, and then when they die, bad things are going to happen. So far, this doesn't align with the biblical account of things, but that's okay, because the Bible is doing something special, which I'm going to get to. So Abraham and Sarah are stressed out that they don't have a kid. Sarah encourages Abraham to go and have sex with Hagar. He does. They have a kid together. That kid is named Ishmael. Then it seems everyone should be happy. Now they have the kid. He can train Ishmael to do the sacrifices, presumably. But things don't go so well. Hagar starts to think that she's more important than Sarah because she's the woman who gave birth to the kid. And Sarah doesn't like that because she's wife number one, and she doesn't think wife number two should be stepping in her place. And so there's drama. And if you know shows like Sister Wives, but problems at home. So Abraham and Sarah basically take turns praying to God, looking for an answer to figure this out. Abraham's God finally comes up with a solution that he says, fine, I'm going to allow Sarah to have a child. They laugh about that because the Bible says Sarah's like 80 years old. She's too old to conceive a child, so she laughs about it. She does conceive a child. He's called Isaac, which means something like laughing out loud. They named him after the fact that it seemed like so funny, but great. Now it should be resolved because wife number one has a kid. Except wife number two and kid number one are still in the picture, and there's still more tension because wife number two says it doesn't matter if wife number one has a kid because that's kid number two, and kid number one's more important. So then more praying to God for more help. Finally, God says, here's the answer to the problem. He tells Abraham, take Hagar and kid number one, pack them up and send them into the desert, and don't worry about them, I'll take care of them. In fact, Ishmael's going to have a whole bunch of kids of his own, and he'll be fine. So Abraham does as he's told. He packs Hagar and Ishmael up and sends them off into the desert, and they disappear from the biblical story until, well, they come back in the Quran later in Islam, but that's outside the bounds of this. So now, happy nuclear family, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac. Everything should be good. No, yeah, some people know this story. So then Abraham says, thank you so much. You gave us what we wanted. What do we have to do? You know, even in the context of the Mesopotamian past from which Abraham comes, what he has to do. He has to make sacrifice to the God. So he's willing to sacrifice whatever it is that God wants. God wants this kid, Isaac. So God says, Abraham, I want you now to sacrifice your child. Here's this painting. And I love this painting because Abraham is depicted here with Isaac, packing him up with the material to build the sacrificial altar upon which he's going to sacrifice the kid who's carrying the stuff. And then you see them walking up the hill together, and up here, Isaac is on the pyre, Abraham, dagger in hand, ready to sacrifice his child. Okay, the biblical account tells us that at the last moment, God intervenes and tells Abraham, this is an angel here intervening, you don't need to kill your son, you've done enough. Here's a ram, happens to be caught in a bush over here, sacrifice that instead, and you're good to go. Now, there's a lot of contention about, especially in because I'm in a philosophy department, philosophers take various takes on whether God is being is in the wrong here, playing games with Abraham or testing Abraham in a very cruel way, or what kind of issues is Isaac going to have growing up after this experience. And so, but I contend that this story should be seen in light of the Mesopotamian background of Abraham, and that what's actually being depicted in this story is the idea that you have a Mesopotamian people stressing out about the need for a son, and to the point where they come up with they contrive their own plan to have that son, a son that they would need to perpetuate the ancestral cult. Succeeding in having that son doesn't resolve any problems for them, it causes more problems. God then gives them this gift child, which they might be thinking, if we're still in the realm of ancestral cult, thinking now this God is giving us the child that we wanted for the ancestral cult, but then that God says, now that I've fixed everything, I want you to send that kid away, send that kid away. In that context of ancestral cult, Abraham is in the story then saying he's willing to give up the ancestral cult for faith in this new form, whatever is going to happen in life or death. He's going to have faith in this particular God. So the story marks a transition between an ancestral cult and the beginnings of a new religion that is going to be Judaism. In terms of afterlife, this is a rejection of the ancestral cult in Judaism. There's no replacement for it. Instead, life itself is seen as the gift, which is itself similar to the Mesopotamian idea. But if you do what God says, He'll take care of you. He ensures that you have a comfortable and happy and long life. That seems, at least at this story, to be enough. Okay, we're in the period between 1000 to 600 BCE at this point. Things will change. First, though, at the same point in time in India, I mentioned the Rishis. This is Rishis. They're the shamans of the Vedic people. Between the period of around 1000 to 600 BCE, society in India is becoming more interconnected. People are becoming less nomadic, and more complex societies are developing. And in those complex societies, various new roles are appearing, including the role of a priest. Different than a shaman, the priest does not consult with spirits. The priest instead consults with texts. And so, the texts in question are the Vedas, like those passages I just showed you. Vedas, which themselves had been spoken before by Rishis, like prophets, getting messages from the divine. Priests write those messages down and become expert in the written message. So that over the period of several centuries, the priest who's expert in the text becomes more important than the rishi who goes always to the spirit to get new information. The idea being, now the information we need is here in the text. You don't need to keep going and talking to the spirits. So the Brahmin priests become the new religious expert. And as they become expert, they start to interpret the words of the rishis in new ways that will apply to a more complex, interconnected, larger society. Okay, now things are going to get complicated, because I want to explain briefly the heavy philosophy of the Brahmanic priests. So I use this chart because the three words at the top are related to each other. The three words at the bottom are related to each other. And at the same time, each word across the line is related one to the other. So I'm going to tell you quickly what these words all mean. Karma. This is the easiest one. Literally, it just means what you do. It means action. So karma is whatever it is that you do. Dharma. This is what you're supposed to do. Your duty. Everybody has something they're supposed to do. If what you do is what you're supposed to do, that's good karma. Right? You're doing what you're supposed to do, that's a good thing. So your action is good if it's what you're supposed to be doing. So good karma is karma that is your dharma. Good action is doing what you're supposed to do. One tricky thing I'll just mention here is that this is a little bit different than the popular understanding of the idea of karma. You think of karma as being the effect of the things that you do, but that's a more modern and popularized notion of what karma means. You are in charge of your karma because you are in charge of what you do. So you do good things are what you're supposed to do. Then your karma is good. Okay. This word, samsara. Samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. It's essentially the place where everything happens. Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake on this slide. If you're taking notes, dharma should be up here and karma should be down here. I mixed that up. Now that I'm looking at it, I can't fix it now, but Karma's down here, dharma's up here. But same thing goes, okay? Because everything that you do happens in samsara. So your karma is in samsara. Sorry about that. So we're in samsara currently because we're living and we're doing things. Everything we do, all our actions, our karma, happens in samsara. Okay. I'm going to skip this word for now and move over here. Atman. Atman is the soul, the self. So each of us is Atman. Atman lives in samsara. And in samsara, Atman does stuff, karma. Every action, every action that you take is being taken in samsara. Each of us is an individual with our own karma, all working within samsara. Each Atman, because these are supposed to be flipped, each Atman has a dharma. It is something that Atman is supposed to do. So, as you live in samsara doing things, you can be doing good karma if you do what you're supposed to do. The Brahmin priests would point back to the ancestral rituals and say, you understand this already because you know there are things you're supposed to do, and those things are ritual sacrifices to the ancestors. And you know that in samsara, Atman does stuff. It either while alive does the ritual sacrifices, but the Brahmin explain the Atman of a person who dies goes to the Paraloka, the world of ancestors. And the ancestor is supposed to do something. If the ancestor is happy, the ancestor is supposed to help the living members of the tribe be successful, strong, have kids, whatever it is they need to do, be healthy. So there is a dharma still for the Atman that is a dead person. And since Atman does stuff in samsara, if it's going to do what it needs to do, it's going to do it in samsara. What that means is that the world of the living is not the only thing that's samsara. The Paraloka is also part of samsara. It's another realm, we could say, but it's still part of samsara, part of the realms in which Atman does stuff. Okay. So far, this is then used to help encourage people in a complex society to do stuff that a lot of people wouldn't otherwise want to do. So, in a complex society, let's say, you have the need for people to clean up the garbage. It's not a thing that everybody aspires to do. So how do you ensure that some people will do the thing that needs to get done when nobody's aspiring to do it? You rely on dharma. There is a duty. Some people have to pick up the garbage. Some Atman needs to pick up the garbage in samsara. So then if you are the Atman whose dharma is to pick up the garbage, if you pick up the garbage, that's good karma. You're doing the thing you're supposed to be doing. Okay. That doesn't help the person who actually has the dharma of picking up the garbage feel good about picking up the garbage. So the Brahmin explain, they introduce the concept of reincarnation. It comes into the picture in the Brahmanic period here between 1000 and 600 BCE, the idea that people will be reborn in new lives. And the Brahmin explain, when you look back at the ancestral cult, you already had a kind of reincarnation. They say, Atman did some stuff, and then it died in samsara, and then Atman became an ancestor. had a new body, an ancestral body. And the ancestor is still Atman. It's just that as ancestor, the Dharma is different, but it still does that stuff in samsara. Okay? They also explained there wasn't just 2 forms of reincarnation available, there were 3 in the ancestral call. Because it's possible that an ancestor could cease being an ancestor. They would cease being an ancestor when there were no more living people offering the sacrifices. And when the ancestor ceased being an ancestor, it became a hungry ghost. And a hungry ghost could cease being a hungry ghost if you could just figure out what it was that the hungry ghost needed and then restore it to an ancestor. The Brahman explained that within samsara, those are not the only 3 forms that a person could be born into. There are a multitude of forms, various kinds of spirits, like ancestors, like hungry ghosts, but also another person, an animal, insect, the whole range of things available to be born into again, all in samsara. And since you have this whole range of things that you can be born as, if Atman has a dharma, let's say, to pick up the garbage, and so its actions align with dharma because it decides it's going to go ahead and pick up the garbage, that's good karma. Good karma makes good things happen. If you live a whole lifetime in samsara as a garbage collector, because you were supposed to be a garbage collector, it might seem like not a lot of good things would happen in your lifetime because you spend it all knee-deep in garbage. But you did what you were supposed to do. So if a good thing is going to happen, it can only happen after you've stopped having to do the bad stuff of being knee-deep in garbage, and the only way that can happen is in the next life. So you live a lifetime picking up the garbage because you're supposed to pick up the garbage, and then in your next lifetime, it will be better. And there will always be other problems, on and on, throughout you can imagine even like the person who has the best career in the world still has problems. They explain here, this term, moksha. All of these lifetimes of reincarnating happen in samsara as Atman keeps being born over and over again, fulfilling various duties through their actions, things getting better and better and better until Atman has done all of the things that Atman had to do in samsara. They could achieve a state of what's called moksha. And moksha is the end of samsara, the escape from that cycle of being born and living and dying on and on and on. It's the ultimate goal in the Brahman system. At this point, you achieve moksha. You no longer need to be reincarnated. You no longer have anything you need to do. Actually, the thing you need to do is just be. Now you don't have to actually do anything anymore. When your dharma is achieved fully in moksha, there's nothing left for you to do, so karma is done. The ultimate retirement. The last term, Brahman. This one is the most difficult concept. Essentially, we could say it's the soul of the universe. Brahman is that from which everything has come. If you ever wonder about the beginning of the universe, the Brahmin priest says it's Brahman. Sometimes people will put, talking about there must be a God, a prime mover, a first cause. And then the question is raised, well, what happened before the first cause? Brahman is that first cause. And nothing happened before Brahman because time didn't exist before Brahman. Everything that is, ever was, will be, all came from Brahman, including time. The concept of before and after come from Brahman. So there can be nothing before Brahman. There can be nothing without Brahman. It's a heavy concept. Atman is Brahman because Atman is part of everything and everything comes from Brahman. So Atman is Brahman. The trick in achieving moksha is the realization of what Brahman really is. And there's no way I can explain it today in a way that even if I spent the whole lecture on Brahman, that anybody here would have a sense of knowing exactly what Brahman is, because the only way to know exactly what Brahman is to experience moksha, and then you're done. You're enlightened being, no longer part of samsara, so that's none of us. That's why it seems like the promise for Atman of doing what it is you're supposed to do will eventually lead you to moksha, and by achieving moksha, a full understanding of the fact that you are Brahman is not going to happen in this lifetime. But that's okay. There's lots and lots of lifetimes. When I'm teaching undergrads about it, I put it in the context of you always have to take this one class that you hate, but you have to take it because it's a general ed requirement. So you have to suffer through. But it's just one class. It only lasts one semester and then you're done. That's in the context of thinking of one lifetime. In the context of thinking of the multiple lifetimes that can happen in samsara, one lifetime is just like no big deal, just like one class that sucks. You just live one life that sucked and you just do it well and you're good. Okay, this whole system is very complicated. And the Brahmin priest recognizes that it's complicated and says to the average Indian, but this is all okay, it's too hard for you to understand. All you need to know is that if you do what you're supposed to do, things will get better, and you can keep going ahead and doing the ancestral cult stuff because that's all good too. So then for the average person, they can focus on their own life, making it better for themselves here and now. They can hope that they can be reincarnated into a better life next time, and they don't have to wonder what Brahman and moksha is, because that's stuff that monks and priests worry about in a future lifetime, maybe far from now. Okay. One more diagram to show the relationship between Atman and Brahman. So this is the ocean, and there are waves on the ocean, and a question can be asked, is the wave an individual? Yeah, some people are no, some people might say yes. The wave, this wave is different from this wave and this wave. There are three waves. Each of those waves is Atman. Each of those waves is us now, here. Each of us is waving on, doing whatever it is that a wave does. But all of those waves are part of the ocean, just like all of the Atman are Brahman. So at the same time as you think of yourself as the individual, the ultimate goal in the Brahmanic system is to recognize that we are all actually Brahman. And in being Brahman, we fulfill our function this time as this wave. If this wave did anything other than what this wave was supposed to do, things would be very strange. So the wave needs to wave and go on and do whatever it does next. Okay, moving on. So take a breath, because Hinduism is heavy. And now it gets heavier. So, around 600 BCE. 600 BCE, it marks a period in time that's sometimes called the Axial Age. It's called that because there are a whole bunch of religious innovations happen in various parts, not just of Asia, but around the world. So I'm going to talk about some of them here, but we have the Hebrew Bible is being written over here. The Confucius and Lao Tzu are doing their thing in China. Zarathustra is a prophet in Iran. And, of course, the Buddha, born in Nepal. So, I want to try to tell you really briefly about how the Buddha comes to interact with Hinduism. Specifically, the Buddha comes into disagreement with the Brahmin priests. So, the Buddha is born into a noble family. His father is like a king or a local ruler. And he really wants his son, whose name is Gautama Siddhartha, to become another great ruler like him. And so he keeps his son protected from the world in a bubble of comfort in the palace. He gives his son everything he could ever want. He spoils him. He has all of the foods, riches, comforts. He marries the most beautiful woman in the land. And despite all of this, Gautama feels like something is missing. There's some purpose that he can't find. So one day, Gautama escapes from the palace and he goes into town and he was searching around. And he sees 4 things that shake his life forever. He wanders around town and he sees an old man walking hunched over with a cane, and he's shocked because he had never seen somebody in that condition before. He didn't know that people get old and start to fall apart. Then he sees a sick man, maybe somebody with leprosy, somebody with sores on their body, and he reels again because he never had been exposed to the fact that people got sick. He was so pampered. Then he stumbles upon a funeral and he sees a man being prepared for cremation. And now he's really reeling because he had no clue. He had been so cosseted away from the suffering in the world. He didn't know that people got old, they got sick, and they died. Then he's left wondering, what's the point of all of these comforts, all of the riches, all of this food, all of the stuff that I had, when in the end, I'm just going to get old and sick and die. Then the 4th thing he sees is a monk, begging in the street, and he realizes, that's what I have to do. So he disappoints his dad, becomes a monk, begging in the street, thinking about the meaning of life. At first, the Buddha, in thinking about the meaning of life, he goes to try to consult the experts in India. Those would be the Brahmin priests. And the Brahmin priests tell him, you can't study the meaning of life. Your family is a noble family. That means your dharma, what you're supposed to do, is grow up to be a great king like your father. Maybe if you do it well, you'll be born as a Brahmin later, and then you can be a priest and wonder about the meaning of life. And the Gautama is not satisfied with that. He really just wants to know the meaning of life now. He's not into this whole going back and being a king for a while. He's seeing the pointlessness of it all. He's not going to do it. He winds up following some other monks who go up against the Brahmin priests. They reject the Brahmin interpretation. They reject the Vedas. They reject all of the ideas of the relationship between Atman and Brahman and the goal of Moksha. And one day, he's sitting under a tree contemplating when a light bulb goes on, and he realizes the truth. Once he realizes the truth, he has a brief moment of wondering what he does with the truth, but right away he knows, based on the truth that he knows, he can only do one thing, and that is to tell everybody what the truth is. So then he goes out teaching, and at that point, people recognize him as the Buddha. Buddha meaning the awakened one, the one who woke up to the truth, who saw through the veil of illusion, who saw through the mistakes of Hinduism. And I think to create a cliffhanger, I saw the sign that we should take a break. The Buddha, the way I'm going to do it, I'm not going to go into all the details of the Buddha's first sermon and all of that stuff. Rather, I'll just go straight to the heart of how the Buddha's ideas of what happens after we die differ from the Hindu beliefs. So, as I said, talking about Hinduism, Brahman is everything. Everything comes from Brahman. Everything is permanent in terms of its relation to Brahman. Brahman is eternal. The Atman, as Brahman, is permanent. The Atman, the self, the soul, is a permanent you moving through time from one lifetime to the next to eventually realize its oneness with Brahman, like a drop of water in the ocean. The drop of water doesn't cease to exist when it realizes it's part of the ocean. The self persists through time in that form of reincarnation. The Buddha, instead, argues that everything is an illusion. In fact, nothing is permanent. Atman is a dangerous illusion which makes us selfish. The idea that the self persists through time causes us to focus on that self persisting through time and the importance of what that self might have in the future. The Buddha argues that the self does not persist through time because it's constantly changing moment to moment. Everything is changing all the time. His experience in realizing that regardless of whatever it is that he had, regardless of whatever it is that any of us has, we eventually get old, sick, and die. Change is inevitable. The end of things is inevitable. The end of all things is inevitable. Every moment in which an apparent self appears, instead Buddhists refer to as rebirth rather than reincarnation. It's the birth of a new thing. Reincarnation then is the incarnation of the Atman again and again. Rebirth is just the recurrence of another birth, of another new thing. From every moment in which there's a change, the Buddha essentially gets to the heart of arguing that if things change, that means they're not the same. That's a simple, basic, logical conclusion. Different is not same. So sometimes we even think about ourselves as I am the same person I was 20 years ago, despite the fact that I've changed. But if you've changed, you're not the same. So the Buddha focuses on the change. And in focusing on the change, he looks firmly at the idea that Brahman, as everything, is permanent and says nothing is permanent. If nothing is permanent, Brahman can't be a thing, can't be real. And the Brahmin priests who have this whole system developed around the idea of recognizing the oneness of Brahman are wrong. So he rejects all of their perspectives. The caste system that organizes people into different social roles, the idea that Atman is a persisting self from one moment to the next, he rejects it all. Okay. I'll leave that for now and come back to how Buddhism might relate to other different views of afterlife later. But for now, we could say on a philosophical level, the Buddha, in his argument that everything changes all the time, would necessarily argue that there would be no permanent afterlife of a thing because there would be no permanent thing to have an afterlife. All right, at the same time, in China, this is Axial Age again, around 600 BCE. We have the appearance of Confucius and Lao Tzu. These are two of a wide range of philosophers in a period that's called the period of the 100 schools. It's a 100 schools of thought, all trying to overcome some war that's happening. They're trying to bring peace to the land. So they all have different philosophies about how to do that. For our purposes, I want to focus mainly on the afterlife beliefs. So I'm going to contrast Confucianism with Taoism. Taoism being the system based on the teachings of Lao Tzu, who I showed here. Lao Tzu, Confucius. So Confucius argued that people are innately good, and that good people show respect. He developed a whole bunch of ritual actions that are necessary in order to show respect. So if you want to behave like a good person, because you are a good person innately, you want to bring that out, you should know the rituals that show respect. In terms of the afterlife, Confucius is sometimes considered atheistic, but he does not ever evince an opinion of atheism. And he's kind of, if anything, more agnostic. But in the context of the ancestor cults, those are among the rituals that Confucius said we should do. They show respect for the dead, regardless of whether or not the ancestors are real. A student asked him whether or not he believed if the ancestors were real. And Confucius answered, "While you do not know life, how can you know about death?" Basically, don't even worry about that question until you've figured out all the questions about how to behave here. On the Taoist side, balance is the key. Good and bad exist in everyone. So that's in opposition to Confucius thinking that everyone's innately good. Here, there is a balance. In fact, you can't have bad without good. They mean nothing without their opposite. If you had only good with no bad, then how could you define what good was anymore? Every person has their own path in life. Nobody can tell an individual which way to go. The balance is their own. That's different again from Confucius, who has the idea that everyone should be taught to do the same kinds of rituals and behave as respectful people. In Taoism, only you know which way you should behave. Inactive, unplanned action using one's gut reactions is best. So, to relate to the idea of afterlife here, I put this quote from the Tao Te Ching: "People are born soft and weak. They die hard and stiff." And you can look at this quote a couple of different ways. Taoism, because they're interested in just how the universe is. It's this balancing of things, and everything has its own way. Everything has its own nature. Death and life are just natural parts of things. These are representations of just the natural state. People are born soft and weak as a baby, and they die hard, stiff as a corpse. But also these are reflective of the philosophy of reacting to things. Soft and weak is better than hard and stiff. Hard and stiff gets broken. Hard and stiff is related to death. Soft and weak bends. It goes this way or that way, whichever way it needs to go. And in doing so, lives. So both of these traditions wind up being ones that emphasize living over dying. Basically, not being so concerned about death and what happens next. Instead, being concerned about how to live life here. They just have two different perspectives on how to live life here. Okay. Things will change there soon, but we'll get there in a minute. Moving forward in time again, we get to now 200 BCE. At this point in time, the idea of resurrection is developed in Judaism. Resurrection being dead people coming back to life. I won't go into a lot of the details of how this idea gets developed, because it's developing in contact with peoples not part of Asia. So Greeks, and then later Romans, they have their own perspectives on the afterlife. And the Jews, at this point, 200, this is after Alexander the Great comes through and takes over the region, and so they're being Hellenized, or at least they're attempting to Hellenize the Jews, and the Jews are responding by not wanting to be Hellenized. And then they're trying to define their people and their people's beliefs in particular ways. And the need for a physical resurrection is developed in connection to the importance of the same idea going way back, that life is the gift that God gave. And if life is the gift that God gave, he gives comfortable, long lives to the people who are doing the right things. While Judaism doesn't talk about karma and dharma, the idea is still there. If you do good, good things happen. And when the Greeks take over and start trying to Hellenize the region, a lot of Jews choose to be Hellenized in order to get comfortable lives. And that seems to totally counteract the notion that if you are doing what God wants, he rewards you with a comfortable life, whereas these people who are explicitly rejecting what God wants are the ones getting the comfortable lives. And so the idea of physical resurrection says the people who didn't turn and be Hellenized, those people who got persecuted for staying with their Jewish beliefs and didn't have the comfortable lives, those people get to come back and enjoy the comfortable life later. Oh yeah, okay, now I know what I'm doing. Okay, so then at this point, because we're almost at the point when Jesus shows up, I wanted to just make a brief mention about the distinction between what can be called universal religions and ethnic religions. So, universal religions are religions who contain within their beliefs the idea that those religions are for everybody. So those are the religions that want to go out and convert people. Ethnic religions are religions where they're not so interested in converting people. Generally, you're born into it. So among the universal religions, you could include Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. In the ethnic religions, Hinduism, Judaism. And Christianity has its influence coming mainly from Rome and Greece when the Roman Empire becomes Christianized, and so that influence starts to come over from off our topic. Buddhism spreads out from India all the way across to Afghanistan and Southeast Asia into China. Then Islam will come into the picture, and then Buddhism will carry on through China to Japan and up into Mongolia and Tibet. So these traditions spread pretty widely, and as they spread, they have their intention of converting other people to their beliefs. So those beliefs then are going to have a much greater effect on the beliefs that already exist there, because there's some debate that will happen at that point. Sharing of ideas. And how this plays out in China specifically. Here's the image showing Confucius, Lao Tzu, and the Buddha. This is called the vinegar tasters. They're all around a vinegar jar tasting it. There's a few different interpretations of that, but the three of them, these three religions start to mingle with each other in China. And originally the two religions of Confucianism and Taoism that had the interest in this life and not so much the next life, they see ideas in Buddhism that are appealing, and Buddhism has as a central tenet something called the doctrine of skillful means. And by skillful means, it's meant that you need to talk to someone in words that they understand in order to convey an idea. So Buddhism, as it enters into these other countries, it not only has to know the language literally of the country, but it has to know the religious language of the people there. So when Buddhists come into China and encounter Taoists and Confucianists, they look for connections. The most easy connections show up between Taoism and Buddhism, and then there's a lot of trading of ideas that happens. Since both Confucianism and Taoism are interested in this life and not so much the next life, the idea in Buddhism that there's also similarly not a long-term concern for afterlife, that fits well into their ideas. They're all three then saying, well, we don't the afterlife, the idea of a permanent afterlife, that's not anything we need to think about. We need to be focused on how to behave here, now, in the moment. In the Buddhist conception of everything changing, then the moment is the thing that doesn't change, because it's this moment right now. And now it's this moment right now. And it is now too. Right. So I can keep doing that all forever. In addition, though, Buddhism brings in this idea of rebirth or reincarnation from India. And in Buddhism, samsara is still the term for all of the place where all of the stuff happens. So in this life, where we do things, we're in samsara. There is the possibility that one might exist in another realm within samsara, as a spirit, let's say. Confucius had the question of, are there ancestors there? He said not to worry about it, just do the rituals. Now you could see a connection of like, well, maybe there are ancestors there. We don't know. That's fine. Maybe that's a possible form in which one could be born. The Taoists, they actually start to incorporate a whole bunch of different variety of ideas around China that include a variety of different spirit beings and demons, and all of those things then fit well within the idea of reincarnation, because the possibility is there that all of these forms are forms into which an ever-changing being might be born. In particular, with the Confucian side, you get a kind of bureaucracy that comes into the picture too, and so you eventually will see ideas of multi-layers of heavens and hells into which a person might enter, depending on whether they did what they were supposed to do or to the degree that they did. And it works out in a bureaucratic way in the Chinese system, where some of the stories have the dead person appears before a kind of clerk, and then that clerk looks through a book and tells them which level they need to go to. They go to the level and meet another clerk that sends them down the hall to which room they need to go. And that's the hell or heaven that they get to spend some time in. Okay, so that's around 100 so now we're after the time of Jesus, right? So we're in around 100 CE is when Buddhism is coming into China. All right, one other group then to mention. Around 600 CE, moving forward through time again, back to the Middle East, the birth of Muhammad. Now, Islam is not part of the group of religions I'm discussing, because those ideas are influenced from outside forces again, namely Christianity coming in and having an impact on the ideas in the Middle East, and etc. But when the time in which Muhammad's born, 600 CE, the pre-Islamic Arabs have a particular belief set. That is, it has obviously going to have some awareness of what's going on in India and what's been going on in Europe with Christianity, in India with Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, because the Jews are living all around the whole region. But the Arabs have a particular religious character as well that incorporates ancestor worship. They have shamans. They're called Kehen. I'll show you a spelling of it, I think, in a second. And those Kehen shamans, when they communicate with the spirits, there are particular spirits that they turn to first for help. Those spirits are called jinn. So here is the picture of the Imam Ali conquering the jinn. And you see all these multicolored jinn, genie. In the Islamic context, these beings are not to be trusted because they're pre-Islamic. They have a different set of beliefs. Essentially, their beliefs are ancestor worship again. They make sacrifice at grave sites, just as the ancestor cults had done for centuries before that. The idea here being, even though I've shown some changes over time in different areas, ancestor veneration is a system that persists. Okay, in Japan. This actually is going to be all across China and everything at this point, but I want to show you something I like to do is to contrast two pieces of art. So, this is a Zen drawing. Here is a Pure Land, a depiction of the Pure Land, okay? A heavenly realm. Maybe you won't be surprised, or some of you will, I don't know. Both of these are the same thing. Both of these pieces of art depict the exact same thing. Both of these are Buddhist representations of the ultimate truth. Everything is here. In the Pure Land context, everything you can imagine, it's a heavenly realm filled with lots of great stuff. It's green gardens, people all over, everyone, all your loved ones, flowers, on and on, it's heaven. Zen emphasizes the fact that everything is ultimately really nothing. There's nothing that's real. This is everything that's real, and it really is nothing, and nothing really looks like this. This Pure Land side helps, I think, to show the idea of how it might relate into the multi-levels of heavens and hells in the Chinese context, for example, and then Tibetan Buddhism is also similarly depicted in these forms. For the average person, it's really hard to get behind this. If I really was getting into teaching Buddhism, then people come away from the first class really depressed, because everything is nothing. Nothing is the thing that's real. You're nothing, I'm nothing, but nothing matters. Is there? Like nothing really matters. It does matter. And this is the most beautiful thing then. It's the everything. This also then is, by contrasting these, to show in terms again of the Buddhist skillful means, how Buddhism looks different in different contexts, because the language being used to express the same idea is different. For the average person looking at this, they might think this one looks nicer, so that's the Buddhism I like. Right? Which is fine, going back even to, when I was talking about Hinduism and the Brahman priests, so that's fine. You can focus on the next life, you can focus on the ancestors, that's all good, so long as you're doing the thing you're supposed to do. Don't worry about what the Brahman is, what I say is the truth of Moksha and Brahman. Likewise, in Buddhism, it's okay if you don't understand what nirvana is or how great nothing really is, so long as you incorporate the things you're supposed to do right now, which is acting selflessly, being a nice person, etc. You'll get there, and it'll be good. And if this looks good to you, that's fine. That's what it looks like. So, when we look across Asia, there are a range of different forms of afterlife. The possibility of physical immortality. The idea of resurrection, that there might be an underworld, that it might have some kind of possibility of an ancestral banquet, that there may be multiple realms, heavens and hells, that you may be reincarnated over time, or that things are just constantly changing. All of those things appear. One of the things I'm also very interested in is experiences relating to the afterlife. So I hope we don't have time to talk at length about these things, but I do want to mention them, because while the beliefs are multiple and different, certain categories of experience relating to the afterlife seem to persist through time across culture similarly. For example, people's experience of ghosts, spirits, angels, demons, gods, whatever, ancestors. I wonder how many people here have ever had an experience of seeing or hearing a ghost or feeling the presence of someone they thought was deceased. Yeah, and Verdi's doing it like this, but quite a few, because it's a perfectly normal part of being human. This happens quite often. Out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, or visitations of spirit worlds. Has anybody ever had the feeling of being outside of themselves? Maybe looking down at yourself from above, or a number of people. Because that's normal too. Usually in surveys of both of these kinds of experiences, you get between 10 to 30% of respondents will have had one or more of these kinds of experiences. 10 to 30% of people is a lot of people. That makes it normal. Often when people have those experiences, they think it's not normal, but it's actually way more normal than we think. Spirit mediums, sometimes shamans, the Kahin of the pre-Islamic Arabs, the Rishis, prophets. I won't ask anybody how many people hear of that. That one's more rare. But every culture all around the world throughout time, they have these kinds of people who can communicate with the spirits. The fact then that people have these kinds of experiences and have had them for thousands of years, it seems to allow the idea of ancestral cult to be the one that persists, regardless of what Orthodox religious teachings might say, the religious beliefs, the philosophies might argue with each other. Whether or not the experiences reflect the truth of whether or not there's an afterlife, they still have that strong connection to the possibility that if there's an afterlife, it looks like an ancestor cult kind of situation. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you.